Hey everyone, Pastor Keith here for another segment of Lite Bites, where we are taking the various emotions that we're experiencing in this pandemic and allowing God's Word, specifically the Psalms, to address those. Today we're going to look not so much at an emotion, but at a condition of the heart that is on the rise in this pandemic, especially as we talk about reopening, and that is pride. I'm going to call it pandemic pride. And I'm not going to define it yet, so hang on. But let's talk about pride to start. Psalm 131 is a beautiful description of what pride is. It's one of the shortest Psalms, but it's one of the hardest to learn. So what is pride? Verse 1, O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. Those words great and marvelous can also be translated wonderful. And that word wonderful is used throughout the Old Testament to describe the works of God. So pride is inserting yourself in the place of God, attempting to do the great and marvelous works that belong to Him and to Him alone. So how are we inserting ourselves in the place of God in the midst of this pandemic? Well, let me give you a couple examples, and each example is going to have two extremes. So first, if we could just focus on saving the economy, saving the market, getting people back to work, getting the market flowing, then everything would be fine. This pandemic would be solved. The world would be a better place. On the other extreme, if we could just focus on saving people instead of saving the economy and caring about people's lives and what this virus is doing, then we would be in a much better place. We would solve this pandemic. The world would be a better place. Let me give you a second example. If everyone would just wear a mask, then this virus wouldn't be transmitted, and we would get through it, get out of it, and move on if everyone would just wear a mask. All right, let me give you the other extreme of that. If everyone would quit fussing so much about wearing a mask and overreacting to this pandemic and this virus that isn't much different than the flu, and if we would stop getting so fussy about masks and sparking anxiety and fear in everyone, then we'd get past this pandemic and the world would be a much better place. All right, let me give you a third example. If everyone would just get on board and in line with the conservative view, then this pandemic would be solved and the world's problems would be solved. On the other extreme, if everyone would just get on board with the liberal point of view, the world would be a much better place. We would get through this pandemic. Now, I've just given you some examples with some extremes. Here's the takeaway. You need to have an opinion, right? You need to have a preference, right? God has created us with a brain to think, and you need to have a preference. You need to have an opinion. Here's the problem. When an opinion or a preference rises to the level of doctrine or an absolute, that is when we begin inserting ourselves in the place of God and occupying ourselves, as verse 1 says in Psalm 131, with things too wonderful and too marvelous for us. So have an opinion, have a preference, but don't let that rise to an absolute. That's where pride sets in. Now, what's the evidence that we're inserting ourselves in the place of God? What's the evidence of pride? It's anger. It's irritability, which leads to judgment, right? We quickly find out when we insert ourselves in the place of God and we try to play God, we realize we're not fit for that. We don't have the power for that. And so when things don't happen the way we want them to happen, right, we can become angry and irritable. And I'll tell you that a lot of that anger is spewing forth on social media. Right? And then that leads to judgment, and we begin judging one another. So if that's what pride is, and that's what pride is starting to look like as we reopen from this pandemic, then what does humility look like? What is humility? Verse 2, But I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. That word calm means to smooth. Think about the rage and the anger that can start to overtake the heart when we insert ourselves in the place of God and things aren't happening how we want them to happen. Right? David talks here about a calming, a smoothing of that rage in the heart. And then quieted my soul, that can also be translated to grow dumb, which is another way of saying to become a learner or to be a learner. Right? Humility is being a learner. Right? That's a disciple of Christ. The word disciple means to be a learner. Right? That we are always learning. That we're learning. We don't insert ourselves in the place of God and demand or think that we know everything and we have every solution figured out. We're a learner. And then, of course, a weaned child with its mother. David gives us just this beautiful imagery of what humility looks like, right? And ultimately where rest comes from. A weaned child. What does a baby look like that's not weaned? Well, as soon as that hunger pain kicks in, that baby explodes, cries, throws a fit until it gets its food. Right? So what's a weaned child look like? Well, a weaned child no longer gets anxious over something he couldn't previously live without. Right? A weaned child is at rest. Ultimately, what David's talking about here and what applies to us in being humble is knowing that God is God. Right? God is God. Be still and know that God is God. You say, well, but things don't seem to be moving or changing in this pandemic, which has brought on so much suffering. God doesn't seem to be doing anything. Well, he's already done something. He's already done something. He's taken the suffering of this pandemic and every other form of suffering that we've seen throughout history, and he put it on his son on the cross. That Jesus absorbed the suffering of the world, not only the sin of the world, but the suffering of the world to put an end to it. God has done something about it. We still see it because Jesus hasn't returned to put an end to it once and for all, but we rest in the fact that God is on his throne, Jesus is on the throne, and he's done something about suffering. So we, like a weaned child with its mother, can rest and in humility find that rest.